Drake Maye's first start, some rookie wide receivers making noise, and everything we're thinking about the two big trades as we finish up our discussion of week 6. So we're talking about today on Stealing Bananas. I'm Ben Gretch. You can find the Stealing Signals newsletter at bengretch.substack.com. With me, as always, is Shawn Siegele. You can find all of his great work over at RotoViz. Shawn, we skipped the Sunday night episode this week. We just did a recording this morning talking through the biggest stories from week 6 around the running back position. Kamani Vidal, the Buccaneers backfield in one of the most chaotic games that I can ever remember watching. That was another thing that we didn't really mention, but that Bucs game was crazy. So, I mean, the rookie running back stuff is very interesting. Obviously, Tyrone Tracy gets another start. There are so many elements to that. You mentioned some optimism about Breece Hall. I want to dig into that. We talked about Brock Bowers on the last one. We just got a lot to get to and more to get to here. The rookie receivers I referenced, I mean, Troy Franklin gets a TD. His routes get up finally. He's playing meaningfully ahead of Marvin Mims now. He's a guy we've been saying keep an eye on. He looks good when he's getting out there. He's got the really good profile. Josh Reynolds is on IR. They went back to Devon Vele, and they're still using little Jordan Humphrey a little bit, but Franklin got used a lot more, and this game was interesting. Bub Means is a name I mentioned to you for any listeners who might just need to find a spot start. That's a Thursday night game. Hopefully this gets to you before that Thursday night game, but Chris Olave goes out with a concussion after just 2 snaps, and Means runs quite a lot of routes in essentially Olave's role and looks good. 5 targets, 4 catches, I think it was, and has a touchdown. Looked pretty good on some releases off the line. They highlighted his touchdown, his release on the touchdown. And it was a good job by the broadcast booth to highlight it. And it was good. I mean, it was good. It was a good route, right? And so he's one. I mentioned Jalen Coker briefly. We saw him play a lot, and Jonathan Mingo kind of get sidelined. Those are all later names from this class. Franklin and Means were day 3 guys. Coker was undrafted, but they all got some usage in week 6 in a way that is intriguing and makes them intriguing going forward. That's a group. I wanted to get your thoughts on. Are there any of them that you're more excited than the others?
Some of this boils down to, what your prior thoughts really were on these guys. Where were you coming into the draft, the preseason, the season? What are your biases, right? Because it's going to be impossible not to look at the players from or through different lenses. One of the things that jumped out to me when I was perusing the SIS data on the quarterback position, because we did get number one, I was trying to hopefully this doesn't sound too mean-spirited, but I was interested in whether or not Will Levis or Deshaun Watson had put up the worst points above average per attempt, and it actually is Levis. The flip side of that, and the points above average includes a charting component, right? That penalizes you for the types of things that we kind of label as turnover-worthy plays. It boosts you when your teammates drop passes, those types of elements. So Bo Nix's EPA numbers do not look very good. The points above average is off of EPA, but includes a variety of other things going on. In points above average per attempt, he looks very good, which I think that is either a mild surprise or a pretty big surprise. Colin was saying, and I thought this was wonderful, that we need fourth quarter Bo Nix more. Certainly we need it more than just the fourth quarter. He looked okay and didn't seem like his teammates were doing much for him some of the time early. He looked fantastic late. Anytime you pick out a player's good plays from a game, they're going to look better than if you pick out their bad chunks. You get the amazing catch by Cortland Sutton in this one. Sutton, to my eye, has not played particularly well this season, but at least is better than what you're getting from the rest of the guys who shouldn't be out there. That's all a long lead in to say that it would have been a very tough catch, but I did think Marvin Mims should have made a better play on the ball, at least give himself a chance on the long pass that was pretty well thrown. I mean, this idea that Nix can't throw the deeper ball. He doesn't have an absolute cannon. He's going to be a fine vertical passer if he is able to survive just overall. And he looks like he will, because one of the things that is so different between him and Will Levis, we talked about this processing element at the end of the previous show. His awareness of space, of the pass rush, of those types of things already looks very advanced. And then his mobility is fantastic. He extended a lot of plays, extended drives at different points with his ability to evade the rush, get up there for the first down, do those types of things, and do it when he needed to do it. The question is going to come down to whether he can make the throws. That part is still pretty up in the air, but I think it helps a lot when you start to get guys like Troy Franklin, Vele out there replacing Josh Reynolds, replacing Lil Jordan Humphrey. A unit that is Sutton and Franklin and Vele, that starts to be, I don't know if compelling is the right word, but it's at least viable. Again, I don't expect people to buy this or believe it or what have you, but SIS now has Nix above guys like Josh Allen in terms of points above replacement on the season. So wherever you are there, I think it does still encourage you that Bo Nix is scoring okay, that he is a hybrid QB, which is so important for fantasy. And then to see Franklin, after the really bad drop in week 5, to come back and move forward as opposed to being sidelined by that, it's very encouraging for this Denver Broncos team, which, as I've said, even with a loss here in a game you probably need to win, I think they're going to be a playoff team.
They only ran 20 plays in the first half. Chargers had a 20-play drive in the first half. I believe the broadcast mentioned that was the longest drive by any team in the league this year. You get to a 10-play drive, that's a long drive. A lot of the scoring drives are like 8 plays, 7 plays, and those are still pretty reasonably long. A 20-play drive, I mean, just think about that. Think about how many third downs you have to convert and then also not get explosive plays. Like, how do you fit 20 plays into you got to gain yards to continue to keep running plays, obviously. Chargers had a 23-0 lead when Denver started to do some of that stuff. I think, one fair criticism would be that, look, some of this was in garbage time. Some of this was against a little bit of a softer shell defense, probably. They're able to move the ball. They have 2 touchdown drives. The counter to that is that the Broncos were, they scored those drives with enough time left that they got the score of 23-16 and actually were in a position to potentially do something. Really, they got it to 23-13 and had a shot, went for 2, didn't get it, got the ball back. They would have needed to get that conversion after their second TD and then another TD and a conversion to get to 23-23. They didn't get the first conversion. They did get the ball back. They traveled down into scoring range again and then take a quick field goal and try an onside kick. That at that point was probably futile. You probably only had the 3 drives is what I'm saying, but they scored the 2 touchdowns on the first 2 and their ability to get the ball back is, I guess, just indicative of the fact that the game wasn't entirely over. They would have had to get two 2-point conversions. But yeah, no, some context around that, but also fair points on your end about how Nix looked. I don't think the listeners are going to believe that Bo Nix has been more valuable than Josh Allen. I think that's probably one that they're going to say is a little bit fluky as far as what you threw in there. But no, great notes. And I do think part of the issue, again, we've talked about this consistently with Denver. They've played some tough games, some weird games. They played that game in the rain in New York. This one, when you're talking about a game like, a stat like that is on a sort of a per play basis, they only run 54 plays in this game, right? 20 plays in the first half. Some of it is you're going to see a little bit better numbers from him in this game than it felt like if you were watching it and you were like, they didn't score until late in the third quarter. It's just some contextual elements to how this game played out. We talked about the running game on that side. The running game for the Broncos looked bad again. Another game situation. You talk about those plays being down and then mostly only running a lot of plays. The Broncos, when they were in big time comeback mode and in pass heavy mode and those types of things, Javonte Williams only catches 3 of 6 targets. That was a little bit annoying because he has been a high catch rate guy. He still has a high catch rate even after only catching 3 of 6. But when you're playing on pass downs late, you need the receptions, right? He only carries the ball 6 times, ends up with 36 total yards. Rough game for him. And they kind of continue to stack up for him. He definitely isn't going to be a high ceiling type of play at this point. The workload's still been strong, and the hope is and remains that if you have a lot of him like I do, that he can still kind of be a high floor guy if this offense does get better, as you were talking about the Knicks stuff, that maybe he can be what Rachaad White was last year, right? Like the lead back in a backfield, although White played every down basically, and Javonte's not doing that, but the lead back in a backfield that is generating some high value touches in those things. Unfortunately, the scoring's just not been there. JJ Zacharyson, our buddy, had a fun stat. Javonte Williams, one of 7 qualified running backs this year with a 50% plus running back rush share per game and a 13% plus target share per game rate again on that. And again, I mean, think about that. Getting over half the running back carries and getting all these targets, that's, really good territory to be in. The other 6 backs in that territory are averaging at least 14 PPR points per game. Williams is averaging 8.6. He's averaging more than 5 fewer points per game than all the other 6 backs that qualify for that. No touchdowns on the season isn't helpful there. The overall offensive environment, the low play volume and some of that stuff is part of the reason as well. He's getting the percentage of the backfield, but the overall offensive environment hasn't been great. Those notes from you on Bo Nix hopefully can elevate the backs a little bit as well, but not holding out a ton of hope right now. But Franklin
Broncos have had a tough schedule, and they do have 3 soft running back matchups in a row now. So this is, we're kind of into the last gasp territory for them. I guess I've been a little bit resistant to the idea that Javonte Williams is as bad as some of the numbers suggest. And there have been some games, including week 5, where I thought he actually looked pretty decent. I don't know that none of these guys look great, Ben. I think they need to put Blake Watson out there. I mean, Aldrick Estime doesn't visually, he only be barely played, but he's not going to be a guy in the receiving game. I think they need a 3-down back. So you're not telegraphing things. You need a guy with speed. You need a guy with a little bit of size. I mean, I want Blake Watson.
Okay. You got him as the 3-down guy. That's why I was in on the Javonte thesis. Part of it was like, oh, the efficiency could be an upside if it actually comes back. That's, I think, what they see Javonte as being is the 3-down guy, everything you just said. And that's what they're doing with him. He's playing a lot. But the way you just described it is how I describe it too. I mean, I was optimistic and I'm getting more pessimistic as we go. We'll see how that goes. But no, you talked about Franklin. Some of those notes about Nix and the offense, I mean, we got to see it. We got to see it soon. Franklin, I had as a good stash long-term, Sean. Bub Means I mentioned as a guy. If you're looking for a spot start, if you've not been rostering a lot of wide receivers on the bench and you have maybe some buys this week or some injuries because you are in one of the, a shallow home league, you've been rostering a lot of running back, upside plays and you're like, okay, I'm not rostering those replaceable players, those wide receivers you're always telling us guys on Stealing Bananas are so replaceable that you don't need to hold these veterans that are not a part of the wide receiver window. You don't want them on your bench. They're just roster cloggers. Okay, so who are the replacement receivers? Bub Means is one of those players, I think, for week 7 that you should be able to just add and then maybe even has a little bit of a role going forward. I don't know, but it seems like he's going to run a decent number of routes on Thursday Night Football. We'll see how that goes. But probably not too different of a scoring distribution than some of those replacement level players that I was just referencing. That people
we talked about
roster.
Yeah, we talked about him a bit when we did sort of our division by division breakdowns back, middle of the summer, and what the Saints would look like. And one of the theories was that maybe Chris Olave would take a decent amount of the intermediate work, or that Juwan Johnson might get freed up for a decent target share because they had so many vertical weapons and didn't have guys with the other parts in their portfolio. One of the things that was odd for me in week 5 was when they're playing Mason Tipton, and that may be fine. He may end up being an interesting sleeper, but Bub Means, I mean, he had some compelling collegiate numbers, and as a vertical threat, you can understand if he's a late rookie that he's being brought along to do a specific thing. I think when you look at their offense and how limited it's been, it's a little disappointing that it would take an Olave injury, but he immediately looked very dynamic. And one of the things here, and I don't want to set this up in a way to make it anti-Drake Maye, because I was very excited about what we got from him, but I did think in the first 3 quarters on Sunday, the Spencer Rattler looked as good, if not a little better than Maye. Now they went in very different directions in garbage time-ish play. Maybe that'll be meaningful, maybe it won't be. But Rattler looked good, and someone who, like we said last week, I said it was non-zero chance that Derek Carr never plays another snap for them. I still kind of think that after watching Rattler play his first NFL game. He looked good to me. You see that combination of size, mobility, arm, all of the kind of intangibles that people had talked about being the more relevant thing to take away about him than what his stats actually were at South Carolina. You put those two things together, it's kind of fun to think about what might happen. Probably nothing is going to come of it, but both of those guys hit at, I would say, a pretty high-end result for the full range of outcomes with them going into that game. If you knew that Means was going to be out there and play some, this is what you would have dreamed of seeing.
Yeah, 67% routes, 8 targets, 5 catches. I think I said that even lower than it actually was on the last episode when we talked about it briefly. He looked good. Like we said, Rattler, interesting takes on him, Sean. He had some mistakes, 5 sacks, 2 INTs, a fumble. I noted in signals they let him throw a bit. His 326 air yards were 4th most on the week, which was helpful for the pass catchers, obviously. Shaheed has a down game, but has like 151 air yards. They were willing to chuck it around a little. I want to go to Jalen Coker in a minute, but I want to dig into the rookie QBs for a moment as you're talking about him. Rattler, again, they were willing to let him throw some, and you seemed pretty optimistic. You just talked about him favorably. You also mentioned Maye, and the way that I wrote up Maye was that fun fact on this game, Sean, they ran 5 plays where they were within 13 points of the Texans in this game. Which you're like, how is that possible? They start the game 0-0. Well, the Texans had the ball first and scored a touchdown. The Patriots went 3 and out. That wasn't on Maye. They went run, pass like teams love to do, which put them in a 3rd and long. We've talked about this. Coaches do this. It drives me insane. You got a young quarterback out there. You think you're protecting him by trying to run the ball. You're not. You're only allowing him to throw in the obvious passing situations. Let him throw in a non-obvious spot. We know the data shows that non-obvious pass downs allow for better efficiency. His first pass in this start, it wasn't his first NFL pass because he played a little bit in garbage time, but his first pass in this start on a 3rd and long, he ends up just basically throwing it away. They punt, and then the Texans drive right down and score another touchdown. It's 14-0 immediately. They did pull to 14-7 right before half when Maye hit Kayshon Boutte. A fantastic throw down the sideline. They traveled the length of the field, Sean, in under a minute from their own 16. That was awesome. Generally pretty awesome drive from him to go 84 yards in less than a minute right before half and hit Boutte for the touchdown to cut it to 14-7.
As soon as they did something slightly unexpected, it worked great.
It worked great. Yeah, they were actually trying to run the ball at the start of that drive. And then they're like, all right, we're going to try and score now. And it worked. Right after half, though, they only get 2 more plays where they're down 14-7 because he gets strip sacked and the Texans go in and score. Again, those were the only 5 plays all game that they ran within 13 points. It was at 7-0, a 3 and out, and at 14-7 right after half, a strip sack on the second play there. The rest of the game, he's in comeback mode. He is in comeback mode for 45 plus minutes of this game. The Patriots were still at a negative 10% pass rate over expected, but because of that comeback mode, their expected pass rate was extremely high, 76.7%, which meant that even though they leaned very run heavy relative to game expectation, they still had a very solid pass rate, 67%, 2/3 of the time they were calling passes. That's not necessarily going to allow for Maye to be, I mean, what I wrote, Sean, is he has 3 passing TDs, 2 INTs, 4 sacks, 1 lost fumble, 5 rushes for 38 yards. This was everything we heard about Drake Maye, and it was on steroids. He scrambles, he holds the ball, he's going to be a willing downfield big game hunter for big plays, and he hit some of them, but he also threw a pick where he sailed one. He threw another pick that was deflected. With all of those numbers on the stat sheet, you might be like, man, Drake Maye is this fun, chaotic young player that's going to do all these things. And I was like, it was frankly a little less eventful of a game than it seemed with all of those events happening. Exciting, certainly. And he showed things, certainly. And yet, a negative 10% PROE and just a game situation that led to all this. I say all that because the way that you said it when you mentioned it was that through the first 3 quarters, Rattler looked a little better, and then their fourth quarters were different. A lot of what Maye ended up, he ends up throwing 2 touchdowns. The one right before half was his first TD of the game. It was their first points. One of his TDs I know was in the 4th, late. Maybe both of them were in the 4th, or the other one was maybe late 3rd or something. I know he was scrambling some in the 4th. A lot of this stuff happened in that 4th quarter when they were way down. They lose this game 41-21, but they get the 3 touchdowns. I don't know. I guess I'm just kind of laying the game situational script out there so people are aware that, most of this game he was playing from behind. Now, a clear step up from Jacoby Brissett, who was averaging like 115 passing yards per game, and Maye goes out there and throws for 3 touchdowns and shows that this offense could have some passing ability. Another note in this game, Jalen Polk drops multiple passes, Sean. We talked about the Husky receivers a lot this offseason. One of the things I mentioned with Polk, kind of like an unreliability a little bit. The couple games that he had late last season where he had no catches when the Huskies kind of needed him, it was kind of a weird note, but we talked about it multiple times throughout the year. You saw that in this game. If you're a Patriots fan, or if you watch this whole game, they needed him a couple times, good passes, and he's just dropping balls. And you're like, for me, it was like, that's what I was trying to describe. That right there. Drops are not the most important thing in the world. Doesn't mean he's not going to have his moments and make good plays, because he does a lot really well. A lot of good contested catches. He'll have some highlights throughout this year still. Anyway, the Polk stuff was disappointing in this one. He'll have his moments. Maye looks good. He elevates the whole passing game. Demario Douglas has a good game. Hunter Henry has a good game. Butte mentioned has a long touchdown. The potential for Polk to be good going forward. Like all the Patriots pass catchers suddenly maybe have some value.
I don't know if I would go that far. I definitely was thinking that, and especially as you describe it there, it kind of makes me want to start Drake Maye every week. I mean, most of our teams are, Jaden Daniels, Jordan Love types of teams. You probably couldn't work him in there, but big picture, start him every week and stream your defense against him at the same time. Both of those seem like they could work out.
We got a couple Fields teams, and if he doesn't start this week, we could just go right over to Maye and, not skip a beat on the, the wild outcomes.
Yeah, he looked good. So the difference there is he doesn't seem always to have a great feel for everything that's going on. But I mean, how reasonable is that? If you think about, with the Caleb Williams stuff, partly it's always just like how much of a limitation is Shane Waldron going to be in any given week, but how much progress Williams has made over the 6 weeks, going from, a little bit concerned that maybe he's overhyped to, at least for me at this point, I'm like, Caleb Williams is going to be a superstar. If Drake Maye progresses anything like that, then, and again, we talked last week, some of his numbers in the past suggest that he could. He's got the ball comes out of his hand again. I mean, he's one of these guys where you're like, yeah, that's what I want to see. That's very exciting. The size, the mobility, he looks like an absolute star, right? That's why they went ahead and picked him there. I mean, I mentioned, if you don't think he's that and you're not going to play him, you should have made the trade and gotten the picks. This is why you don't take the picks. Drake Maye looks like the potential to be a franchise savior. Those drops from Polk. We talked a lot about him during the summer, and yet still, when you think about the things people are saying about him, where he was being drafted, which wasn't super early, but for someone in that situation was enthusiastic. But then, man, he looked bad. The Patriots, unlike the kind of situation we just mentioned with Troy Franklin, they have more or less said that they're going to try and give him a mental breather because he's playing that poorly. Now, what that actually means, we'll see. But we had kind of stashed him on a few teams. He's sort of our last guy. We were debating whether or not to cut him. I think he's cuttable right now if your team is deep enough and there are also options on free agency. Those two things are not the case in all situations. But I guess I'm willing to take that risk, even with how good Maye looked and how Polk could be the eventual biggest beneficiary as their guy with the most upside. You talked about the play calling. Better play calling will probably help. I don't know. I don't think that having a full season of garbage time is necessarily the worst thing for him, again, with how good he looked down the stretch here. But yeah, it destroys the efficiency of your team when you are so predictable. Antonio Gibson comes into this game with great peripherals, which I think is fantastic for him. I was very skeptical about Gibson. Comes in with fantastic peripherals in this game. He has as many stuffs, 5, as he has total yards before contact. That won't work.
Yeah, he was a weird one in this one. I wrote it the way you just said it. I mean, same thing. That he's looked good working off of Stevenson, and then we get this opportunity for him to be a lead back, and he looks horrible. It's just like, what? That's a bummer. Yeah, I mean, Ramondre Stevenson's just clearly the best running back on this backfield. That's why they were so hesitant to bench him when he was having the fumbles issues. They were saying, well, you can't preach ball security is job security and not bench him, but they benched him and they brought him in like the first quarter of that game, and then he had a long touchdown, and they're like, look, just stop fumbling so we could not make it. We don't want to have to make an example out of you because we got to teach everyone, has the same rules, but at the same time, like, you're clearly the best player we have on offense. Outside of the quarterback position now, it looks like Drake Maye definitely a better option than Brissett right now. The way that they got there is, open for debate. I argued in the preseason that Maye looked way, way better than Brissett. It got me more on Maye. I had been like off him in best ball and some of those things. I wanted to at least see the way that worked out in August. I was still able to get to a very solid overweight position on him. And it looks like he's going to be a fun piece of, the late round best ball puzzle. But like you said, like, is it Polk? Some of the stuff is like, what do you do with the stacks? I mean, the way that I wrote it up, for best ball, but what stacks are going to hit, I guess is the way I should say it. I don't know the answer to that. I wrote it up this week as, Demario Douglas was the clear best and should be the most consistent. All the pass catchers experience a bit of a boost, but he gets 9 targets here, 36% targets per out run, strong game from him. And he has a kind of a specific role, but like Butte and these other veterans, whether, if they pull back Polk a little bit, maybe they use Kendrick Bourne a little bit more. He only ran routes on about 48% of the dropbacks here, but you could see his role expand. KJ Osborne's banged up right now, I believe. You have Javon Baker still floating around somewhere. But it doesn't seem like he's going to make a huge impact this year. The vertical roles, the outside receiver roles, do seem a little bit up for grabs, and it's a little bit confusing how that might play out. I mentioned, Sean, I wanted to talk about Coker as well before we move completely off the receivers. Mainly the point that I wanted to offer on Carolina is I think this could be a really interesting situation. I've talked about some upside for Liget there because of the Mingo thing where, like, you're running routes against somebody who's not very good. Deontay Johnson's going to dominate as the lead guy, but he's not going to be the only guy who gets targets. You have Liget, you have Coker, you have Jatavian Sanders all running a lot of routes there. And then you now have one of these drop back pocket passers, veterans who can at least facilitate. And it looks like Dave Canales has these guys in a decent position. Their defense is bad. The fact that it's their run defense is a little bit of a problem because, like, sometimes they don't get enough play volume in or enough opportunity on offense because the opposing team is really dominating time of possession. Atlanta in this game does that. It doesn't necessarily dominate time of possession, but dominates on the ground. We get a 100-yard game from Algier, who you mentioned in the last episode looked fantastic. I want to talk about the Bijan Algier thing as well a little bit, but Bijan 95 yards and 2 touchdowns. They combine for 200 rushing yards. But Andy Dalton still drops back 38 times in this game, or throws 38 passes, excuse me, had more dropbacks still than that even. An opportunity, I think, and in a setup where they're going to probably be chasing, but they were more competitive in this game. I think people think the Panthers are worse than they are. They're 1-5. I think people think they're the worst team in football. The market seems to think it as well. Their lines are really low. When Andy Dalton took over, they went into Vegas and won. They haven't played as well in every game. They're inconsistent. They're not great. They're not a good roster. I'm not making that case. This Falcons game, they lose 38-20, but they were more competitive than that line indicates. They were playing pretty well into the third quarter. It's 25-20 when the Falcons make a field goal with 7 seconds left in the third quarter to make it 28-20. And then the Falcons score 10 more points in the fourth, and the Panthers turn the ball over. Andy Dalton throws an interception on that ensuing drive when they're down 28-20. They get across the midfield, and they're moving, and they throw an interception. And then again, the Falcons are able to run the ball back on them, score. Now you're down 35-20. The game's kind of over at that point. But they were more competitive than I think people realize. And I basically the note on Coker and on the situation, whether it's Leggett, whether it's Coker, whether it's Jatavian Sanders, one of these rookies looks like they're going to potentially make some noise this season. You talk about back-weighted production. There is an opportunity here for a number 2 target to emerge, whoever it may be. It's a situation to monitor. Carolina's not that bad. Andy Dalton has not played as horrible as their 1-5 record might indicate. He's probably, maybe Bryce Young comes back in, but he's probably going to be the starter for a while if they can win some games. And I think they will win a few games. I think they'll steal a couple here. And then you think about like the late season stuff. So in terms of maybe stashing players, deeper leagues, you're in a deep dynasty format, whatever. Coker's a guy I would add to rosters. Leggett and Sanders are probably on rosters in dynasty, but are maybe deep manage the league guys to add, because this opportunity is there if any of these guys starts to string together some good football.
And we started to see the athleticism from Jatavian Sanders that is controversial in a way, because his athletic testing was so poor that it got huge chunks of the fantasy and reality community out on him, in part because athleticism is so important at the tight end position. And yet everything about his collegiate career, from how he was recruited to how he performed, suggests that he is one of these guys who's going to be a potentially elite, but at least a solid receiving tight end. I think that part is very exciting. You talked about what the Panthers have done. Andy Dalton has made a couple of the guys really exciting. Deontay Johnson, who was the player that you told everybody they had to have, he has been fantastic. He's, I think, the wide receiver 6 or 7 over the last 4 weeks with Andy Dalton. He was a tough start this last week because the Panthers haven't been that clear on where he is health-wise, but then he looked really, really good. So hopefully that means that we're now more or less in the clear. I mean, obviously you can suffer a new injury on any play. Chuba Hubbard, since Andy Dalton was inserted, is the number 3 back in expected points. He's also outperformed that to a pretty good chunk to work. He's the RB2 in the last month. He's probably not a star, and yet on the season, his yards after contact per attempt, which especially for a back like Hubbard, is arguably important in that that's not exactly what you would expect him to be good at, right? He is a speed back when everything works, but it's 2.9. It's the same as Derrick Henry. It's the same as Bijan Robinson. If he can do that, I mean, I'm a little bit frustrated because Hubbard has been one of my absolute favorites, and yet I have very little, because part of what we're trying to accomplish is what we're getting with Bucky, with Tyrone Tracy, with Vital, with Ray Davis, where you're on the guys who are going to emerge as the season goes. And I mean, think of like, it's a slightly different situation, but Chase Brown, and your roster is incredibly powered up at playoff time. You need to score enough points to get there, but then you have these super rosters with Jonathan Brooks coming in to, really limit him when fantasy matters the most. I thought he was tricky even at his price, which was very affordable. And now you really wonder. So it does seem like Brooks is finally pretty close to ready. It seems like he will take that backfield over. But one of the things that's kind of frustrating now in both directions is we did stash a decent amount of Brooks, and you're wondering just how much can he really do with Chuba Hubbard being one of the best backs in football right now. So the Panthers, with Andy Dalton kind of doing that Ryan Fitzpatrick thing, they can move the ball, which is incredibly important for fantasy and makes them a fun team actually to watch right now, which it's been a long time since that's been the case for the Carolina Panthers.
Love the way you put that on Chuba and the impact on Jonathan Brooks. Been getting asked a lot about that as well. And I've been kind of saying it the way that you said it, where it's like, it's very obviously not great for the Jonathan Brooks situation that Chuba's playing like one of the best running backs in the NFL. Brooks is still going to get his opportunities because it's sort of the, you put the draft capital into him and all those things. That's just sort of the way these things work. I mean, there's that anti-fragile element that things move in his direction. Chuba's got to be flawless to not give up some of it, but and even still, he'll give up some of it, right? There'll be a little bit of a committee, but Chuba will stay involved, I think, if he keeps playing at this level, which is the idea was that Brooks might be able to take over quite a bit of it. You mentioned Chase Brown. Interesting stuff around that game. The Bengals only run 50 plays, fewest in week 6. They also have the highest pass rate over expected in week 6, plus 10.5%. So they came out throwing and, weren't actually sustaining drives particularly well. It's a very kind of slow game. I wrote about it in Signals. It wasn't that they were just like 3 and outs on both sides. The teams were sort of moving the ball and then just not executing on, it's, again, we talk about it being a game of possessions. You had a big play for Darius Slayton off an RPO, wiped off for an eligible downfield. You had the Bengals getting good starting position at one time, and then Zach Moss loses a fumble. You have the Giants getting across midfield at one time. Daniel Jones' arm gets hit, forces an incompletion and a punt, which pins the Bengals back. You have the Bengals at one point around midfield. Jamar Chase has a key drop on 3rd down that would have pushed them across into Giants territory, and they punt and pin the Giants back. This is one of those things where like these teams are getting the ball in bad starting position, moving it a little bit, and then not able to get over the hump, and then they punt and they pin the other team back. It's a field position game. These kinds of football games happen, right? But both teams do end up over 300 total yards. That's not a ton, but you look at a 17-7 game, you're kind of expecting 220 total yards on both sides in one of those really boring games, more like what we saw in the Titans and Colts or something. There's a little bit more offense in this game. Chase Brown, 62% of the snaps, 41% of the routes, gets to 12 touches. Zach Moss only gets 7. I saw some people on Twitter talking about Moss loses that fumble. He gets benched for that. Brown started this game. Brown got a lot of work early. He also got the key play on a 3rd and goal from the 1, where on 2nd and goal, T. Higgins caught a pass down to the 1. It was their first snap inside the 5. It was 3rd down, and they said, we're going to Chase Brown on this play. He scores, but there's a holding, and it gets moved back. Later in the game, Chase Brown also fumbles going into the 2-minute warning. They have some time to think about it. That fumble went out of bounds. So it wasn't a lost fumble like Moss's, but still, you put the ball on the turf. They have some time to think about it. They come out of the 2-minute warning and they say, we're going to Chase Brown. And he rewards them with a 30-yard touchdown on the very next snap. I don't think this was just the Zach Moss fumble benching outcome here. I think this was the Chase Brown. We started him and we were planning to use him more. They've been doing that over time. Just wanted to note that because some people are downplaying how big Chase Brown's role got here. And I don't think you should. I think you should be very optimistic. Sean, this is a guy who through 2 weeks, people were talking about cutting. People were victory lapping. How could you not have been on Zach Moss on Twitter? You and I talked about it on the show. We called him one of the biggest buy lows at that time, a true buy low. And I know it doesn't feel like it now, but there was a moment there where it felt like Chase Brown's value had disappeared. And it did fall. We acknowledge on the show his value's gone down. But now he's still in a position where he could come back and take that work from an inefficient starter. I think we comped him to Bucky Irving at the time. I was looking back in some of my writing from Stealing Signals. I'm pretty sure we would have made the same comp on the show. That he had fallen back in value towards the Bucky Irving range. After week 2, you're still relating back to ADP. Bucky Irving at the time was like a round 15 ADP guy 2 games into the season. Brown was around 10 or 9 guy. But felt like, he lost a few rounds of value, but he was still a meaningful stash that he could just, from a talent-based perspective, take this work. little bit of concern because Zach Taylor played Joe Mixon for years, even though he wasn't always the most efficient guy, that they might just play Zach Moss. They still like him. They're using him on the pass downs. But Chase Brown, to me, is taking over this backfield right now. It's happening in real time. They only play the 50 snaps, but they made sure to get the ball in Chase Brown's hands when it mattered in the key spots. I think you're going to continue to see that. They need that explosiveness.
Yeah, I can't be unbiased enough to give fair responses on Chase Brown. Absolutely loved him. Drafted him a ton. So excited for him. I have a note in the David Montgomery section of the Zero RB universe that Montgomery ranks number 1 overall with a 56% positive rate. He's the only member of the 50% positive club who also has a 10% or better boom rate. One of the interesting things about these positive guys is a lot of them are a little more grinders. The two backs who are close is Kyron Williams, who just misses on the boom rate part, and Chase Brown, who just misses in both categories. When we look at specifically this game, it was, I don't know if amusing is the right word, because again, you're not rooting bad things for people, but Zach Moss, 2.2 yards per attempt, 0.8 yards after contact, 0 evaded tackles, fumbles, posts the lowest EPA of any back in football. All of that happened on a mere 6 carries. So again, I mean, you're talking about, minuscule samples as well. It seemed like Chase Brown had this job sewn up simply by just not being Moss. But then he fumbles. The nice thing for him, as you sort of alluded to, is that if you don't lose the fumble, you tend not to get as much blame. That may be more or less true on different coaching staffs with different sort of personalities of the head coach or the decision maker in terms of playing time. The really fun part here,
when you're the explosive player, like, why were they so much more punitive with Moss? Was it because of a lost fumble, or was it because they already kind of wanted an excuse to bench Zach Moss? I mean, you got, like you said, it's hard for us to be unbiased. I will note, I said Chase Brown started. Zach Moss had a carry on like the 4th play. Chase Brown got a carry on the first play, got a target on the 2nd play, but Moss was in there in the first drive. It wasn't like Moss was not playing early or anything like that. He wasn't the clear backup. It was sort of a 1A, 1B, whatever. Brown starts. But yeah, I mean, I don't know. I was just kind of reading it more as it gave him an excuse to bench Zach Moss. It's sort of like we were talking about with the Stevenson thing where, they finally had to bench Stevenson because of all the fumbles, but they're like, will you just stop doing that? Because we want to play you. You're the one we want to play.
Well, I think that in a lot of ways, the Bengals would like this to be, and they know that they don't have the same level of talent, but they would like it to be a David Montgomery and Jahmyr Gibbs situation, understanding that both of those guys are a lesser version of the Lion Stars, but still pretty viable. I think the fact of the matter is that Zach Moss is enough down that he does hurt you, and that's especially a problem when you're the Bengals and you've gotten off to this really bad start. Chase Brown is also not Jahmyr Gibbs, but his explosiveness is off the charts, which is really helpful. And so you think about then how this game ended, which I also thought was just a really cool story. I have been not a big Zach Taylor fan. Anybody who listens to the show knows that. I just don't understand what they're doing most of the time. I don't understand why they're not ready to play the first month of the season. Chase Brown on this 3rd and 4, whatever it is, with 2 minutes to go, blows through the line. There's no one around. He gets to the goal line instantaneously because he's that fast, dives into the end zone, celebrates. Then you have all of the things of, you should have gone down at the 1 yard line. You used to run out the clock. I mean, he mentions even that he needs to have a better awareness. His coach is like, no, that's on me, 100% on me. I'm very focused on finding the place to get us that first down there, and didn't do a great job. I didn't do any job communicating that, to be frank with you. There's 1:58 on the clock. They have a timeout. I don't expect our guys to do the math in the huddle. It's my favorite coaching quote ever.
That's cool.
He's like, I don't expect him to do the math in the huddle. He's fine that Chase Brown scored. I think everybody who enjoys football is glad Chase Brown scored.
And good on him for wearing it, because it is his job to communicate that. And a lot of the coaches be like, yeah, we'll go back, we'll look at that. They don't. He's like, no, that's on me. 100%. I didn't do any job communicating it. No uncertainty there. Yeah, like you said, we're not always sure what Zach Taylor's doing. That's some good coaching. Couple more little fun things with Brown. I just wanted to make sure this before I said it a second earlier, but this was the first game he started. I've kept emphasizing that. I do just want to clarify. This is the first game he was actively out there on the first snap as a starter. Here's another stat. His special teams snaps by week, Shawn, 9, 15, 14, 18, 23, 2. 2 against the Giants last week. Again, it goes to say that like Moss fumbling in the third quarter was not the only thing that led to Chase Brown at 62% of the snaps. By the way, another stat, first 5 weeks, his season high, 40%. So when I'm saying 62% of the snaps for Chase Brown, 22 percentage points higher than his previous snap share season high. Some of that could have been relative to the fumble, right? That he got pushed all the way to 62%. What I'm arguing is he was pacing to play a bigger role in this game. From the moment that he started, from the lack of the special teams reps, all of it to me was very clear watching before Zach Moss fumbles in the third quarter. So yeah, a lot to be excited about with Chase Brown. I got to ask you about
the other thing that wasn't
things.
clear though, I as we kind of go off of this, is that it's also not clear how healthy either one of these guys were. And I do think that potentially factors into the usage in ways that we can't know, because Moss, some injury issues during the week. Brown actually had the Q tag, I believe, with a quad injury, but Taylor had said that's nothing. He's going to be fine. So who's 100% is going to matter some too as we go forward.
That's the best point that you've made that I want to soften everything I've said, because early in the week, it sounded like Moss might not play. Right. And then Brown popped up as a late week addition, and that can sometimes be scary, but it seems like that's happening more where the teams don't want to get fined and things because they've been told that they got to get these guys on the injury report. And so some of them, they're popping up late week and it's nothing. And that's what seemed to be the case with Brown here. He probably was the healthier of the two. It's a great point. The other two big notes I want to get to, and then we got to get to the trades a little bit, Shawn. Breece, Bijan. They both have really talented backs behind them. Todd Downing takes over the play calls, and Breece plays a season-high 87% of the snaps. Braylon Allen is in a complete afterthought role in this one. He does score a touchdown. He gets some goal line work, which is a little bit frustrating, I should say. Scores a touchdown that gets called back, but 87% snaps, 76% routes. Both are season highs for Breece Hall under the new play caller, Todd Downing. Braylon Allen looks like more of a handcuff going forward. You mentioned maybe he's back in the mix to be the number one overall. Bijan Robinson, I've been talking about, is still going to, it's not over for him. He's still going to have some 20-point games. He's a 25-point game here. He scores on both of his first two green zone touches on their first two drives, 2 touchdowns for him. Tyler Algier winds up with more green zone work in this game. He winds up with 5 green zone touches to 3 for Bijan. He only scores 1, though. And all of Algier's came after Bijan had scored 2 touchdowns. Some workhorses will get that opportunity to score the third. We saw it with Kyron Williams earlier this year, for example. You'd love for them to just keep going to Bijan. They did try to get Algier a TD is sort of what it felt like to me, give him several opportunities across multiple drives. But that was all after Bijan had already scored twice. Having said that, Algier looked like a really good runner in this game. I'm not denying that part of it at all. But I did leave this game a little bit optimistic about Bijan, even with Algier having 100 yards and a TD rushing behind him. It's not quite as optimistic as the Breece Hall stuff, where you see the new play caller immediately put him back in this massive role. Bijan only plays 56% of the snaps here, but a big gap in routes. 63% of the routes for Bijan, only 17% for Algier. We've seen that consistently. He's getting the receiving work, obviously, and then he got the first 2 opportunities in the green zone. So I called Algier's 5 green zone touches kind of more noise, where they went to Bijan the first 2 times down there, and he converted. And that's, I think, positive. And Bijan has looked good with some of the evasiveness and some of that. He has 92 rushing yards on his own in this game. He's good. Algier's also very, very good. The Falcons look like a fun offense as well. And it was good to see Bijan have that 25-point game. Maybe he's not going to be the 101, because the idea was that Algier's not playing 41% of the snaps like he did here, and he's not running 18 times for 105 yards, that Bijan is the guy. It's not happening, and it's not going to happen. You talked on the first show this week that Algier had a fantastic run through contact. That one made some noise on social. A lot of people saw that circulate. How do you compare Breece and Bijan right now going forward?
I think the way that you put it was perfect. We know that the market share of touches at the running back position in many cases gives you a better feel. Blair at times has written these really nice articles talking about market share of EP. I think that you have to take that on a team by team basis. And you have to understand how good the offense is going to be, how talented the running backs in question are. It's certainly a problem for him that Algier is doing so much, but a little bit of that actually comes in the correct order that we discussed. Also, I believe at the end of the previous show, where if you have the Bijan points banked and the team is like, we're going to make sure we get him out there, we get the lead, that we've used him, and somehow the game doesn't end with him on the bench not having played, it's not that that wipes away the problem of Algier being so good and so involved. But I do expect the Falcons now to end up as one of, if not the team that has the most total EP, the most total fantasy points to the running back position. If that's the case, it worries you a lot less. The situation with Breece Hall was fantastic because I don't trust that coaching staff, Aaron Rodgers, anybody involved with it to get two backs enough points as we thought might possibly be the case very early with Braylon Allen and then looking good. Breece needs to be the guy. He was the guy. I didn't think the firing was fair, but the thing that I mentioned and wrote about is that if there is a potential silver lining here, it's just that you didn't get the impression that Robert Saleh loved Breece Hall in the way that we do and that you probably should. One of the reset elements to the changes that they made is that this appears to be a Breece Hall team. And then he came out and performed. It is a little bit of a weird dynamic where you mentioned he lost the potential touchdown. It is a soft matchup. He had the run where, even Troy Aikman is talking about, like, how did he not get in? And that would have been 6 more points for him. That would have been great. He just has the one guy to beat. It was a weird vibe where you're kind of watching him and you're thinking he's going to cut it to the center. No, he's going to act like he's going to cut it to the center and he's going to beat that guy to the pylon. It's like, no, he has failed to make up his mind and he's going to slow down and jog into the one defender who is left, which is what he did do.
Why did he do that?
So that part was disappointing. I'm excited about the way this is going. And as it sort of leads into the element here with the Davante Adams trade, I guess I'm okay with it, right? I think that the offense is going to be more explosive. I think that, Davante Adams takes away those Allen Lazard points. So if you're thinking about, like, I'm somehow losing to Allen Lazard managers, that's probably not going to be the case in the future. If you're looking at it from, like, how many points and how many red zone opportunities, how many touches from inside the 5-yard line, there could be more. You're thinking about how inefficient Garrett Wilson has been. Like, yeah, he's not going to have this insane target volume going forward, but his yards per target could double. I mean, Garrett Wilson should still be better than Davante Adams at the 2 points that they are in their respective careers. I mean, a lot of people are going to say they're just so gapped to start with that even if Davante Adams comes way down from that, and you also then get more efficiency from Garrett Wilson, maybe we've been overly enthusiastic about Wilson. Maybe Adams hasn't tried at all, which I think is very much the case. But you have to consider where we were with Allen Robinson when he wasn't trying, seemingly. Again, Davante Adams is not going to come out and be the washed up version of Allen Robinson. He's going to be good, but I mean, I even have a few teams. So this season has been so much fun because it's mostly Jaden Daniels. There's a little bit of Jordan Love off of that. But I think I do still somehow have, like, 2 weird teams that are very good and have a mix of, like, Aaron Rodgers and Bo Nix and Andy Dalton, for goodness sakes, as the guys I'm trying to stream. I'm fired up about the Jets. If nothing else, there's some drama here. How do you see the Davante Adams trade for him, for Rodgers? But how is it going to affect these two guys we love in Garrett Wilson and Breece Hall?
I didn't really think through the Breece impact when I wrote it up, but it's favorable, right? It's favorable for the offense. It's always going to be a little bit more favorable for the back. But I guess I was just thinking like he's going to get his work anyway. He's in a lot of ways is a big plate threat, but he should get some more, green zone opportunities to score short touchdowns, I guess. And then the way that I wrote up his impact was like Tyler Conklin to me is no longer relevant because Breece is going to be the third weapon in the pass game. Like I'm redoing the projection in my head when I see this trade. I saw some people talk about like Allen Lazard's not going to go away. When I redo the projection in my head, I'm like, Allen Lazard's going away. Like not entirely, but it's important to note he has two really good games. Week 1, he scored 2 touchdowns. One was on a free play where they got a jump and he had the vertical route and Rodgers just threw it up to him. But like he also won on his route. Congrats. I mean, he won on his route. It's good work, but it was a defensive offside. Rodgers putting a ball up, The second one was from Tyrod Taylor in garbage time. And then last week was his other big game, and he caught a Hail Mary, a 52-yard Hail Mary at halftime. He also has 2 other touchdowns this season. He's made some other plays. I'm not saying he hasn't been good. A lot of what he's done is the stuff that Rodgers wants to be able to do at the line of scrimmage. He wants guys he trusts. Rodgers likes his guys. He wants to be able to change the play at the line of scrimmage, etc. He's still going to have Lazard out there as a third receiver at times, and he's still going to go to him in some situations. I'm not saying he's not going to. But that stuff isn't the entirety of the offense. Like, I don't think that when they add Adams, they're going to double that. And like, it's going to be all Lazard's pre-snap read stuff and all Adams stuff. It's just like all the pre-snap read stuff is just going to go to Adams. He sees single coverage or whatever. He likes this matchup. Then he signals something to Adams instead of to Lazard. You know what I mean? Like then there's other plays where based on the coverage or whatever, he's got to just go with the concept and get through the progression or what have you. And Garrett Wilson, I was more concerned about the potential trade when this rumor started, when Adams first asked for a trade. Garrett Wilson has 33 targets over the last 2 weeks and 21 catches, and that's a really positive element that really changed my opinion here. Rodgers and him starting to cook a little bit. Him starting to get plays on different types of routes and on extended plays and some of those things. Fantasy Points, Scott Barrett shared a quote on Twitter the other day about Rodgers saying in their last season together in Green Bay that Adams was the first option in the progression on 80% of their plays. And you understood why back then. Marcus Valdes-Scantling, Allen Lazard, those are the only other 50 target guys on that offense. And Aaron Jones were the only other 50 target guys on that offense. And Adams had 169 targets. They were both younger. Aaron Rodgers was better. Davante Adams was better. I completely agree with everything you just said about Adams, where like, he's still going to be great and he's going to get a lot of the first read stuff. I think he's going to lead the team in targets. I think he's going to be ahead of Wilson in targets. But I do think you're going to use Wilson off of that in a way that you're not using Marcus Valdes-Scantling and Lazard off of that in that offense. And also because Davante Adams isn't that 28, 29-year-old that he was the last time he was in Green Bay. He's now 32, and that matters. That's relevant. He's 31. But that is relevant, as you were talking about. Like, it's a little bit of a different level of certainty of all of that stuff. There's just no reason you would have him be the first option in 80% of the progression when you can, or the first option in the progression on 80% of plays, when you can go to Garrett Wilson on some of these plays at the line of scrimmage. You will also probably still go to Lazard and some of that stuff. But the way that I see it, if I'm projecting this, I'm looking at it like start of the season. This trade happened in May. I'm projecting Adams to lead the team in targets and Wilson to be kind of the number 2 off of that, but for it to be very close. For Adams to be at about 26% target share. He's always been a 30% target share guy, in part because of that stuff we were just talking about, where he's the first option in the progression. He hasn't had a Wilson for a long time. You go back earlier in Rodgers' career when he did have 2 guys, 2024, Jordy Nelson and Randall Cobb, both over 90 catches, 1280 yards, 12 TDs. 2014. Now that's 10 years ago. Aaron Rodgers, a lot better quarterback back then. 2016, Nelson and Adams were both over 75 catches, 997 yards, I wrote, because Adams was just shy of 1,000-yard season. And they both were over 12 TDs. In both of those 2 seasons, he had 2 different receivers over 12 TDs Again, obviously a long time ago, but it really is the last time that you have two really good receivers working with Rodgers, because it goes on to Adams' peak and no other guy. Randall Cobb ages out. They never really have another guy. And also Rodgers loses a couple seasons to injury after that. So, I mean, look, I get it. They're not going to do that. It's not going to be the 2014, 2016 Green Bay Packers passing game here. And yet Rodgers has done this with multiple stars before. And this is the first time he's had two players of this caliber since then, really is the point that I'm trying to drive home. I don't think the 80% of the first read and the progression type thing is going to be what happens here with Adams. You're going to go to Wilson in a lot of these spots as well. So I said, okay, look, Adams was a 30% target share guy. I got him about 26%. I got him coming down a little because you don't need to push him that high. And then I got Wilson at like 24%. And I got both of these guys at about 50% combined, which is something that we do see in some of the good passing games. The top two guys getting in 50%. Sometimes they can approach 60%, where they're both up around 30%. And I think that's possible here, that these two guys are both actually pushing above 25% of the targets. The rest of the targets then, I think, really get scattered. But the third guy is Breece Hall at that point. He's the check down. He's the guy that you go to. And so Conklin is not getting as much. He's getting some, but not as much. Which fits with, again, Rodgers' history. Some of the tight ends that he's had that were good were all efficiency based, but never got a lot of targets. Like Robert Tonyan and Jermichael Finley and those guys never really got a ton of volume. Conklin's going to be a little bit used. Lazard's going to be a little bit used. There's going to be some games where those guys are used a little bit more, but I don't know. That's the way, when I think about it from a projection standpoint, I'm like, Adams and Wilson are going to consolidate downfield, and they're going to do different things. And everything you said about Wilson working off that and not getting his Adams is going to draw way more attention than anyone else Wilson's played with, right? And that's awesome for Wilson. So yeah, everything you said, I agree with. The other huge note is just the guy that we talked about last show. Adams is gone now from Vegas, and so Brock Bowers is going to have plenty of room to get as much volume as he needs there. This was a fun trade for fantasy, I think, on both sides. I think it's good. I'm nervous for Garrett Wilson. He does lose a little bit of value, but it elevates the Jets offense. It puts them, like, if you think that Adams is going to come in and be really good, then that's also good for some of this stuff, right? It's good for the offense. If you're telling yourself that Adams is going to come in and he's going to be Rodgers' guy and they're going to do all this stuff and be really efficient, okay, they're moving the ball. They're getting in great spots. That's why I was talking about those 2014 and 2016 teams. When you had Jordy Nelson as that guy, Randall Cobb also had a really great year off of that, 12 touchdowns and 90 catches and 1,280 yards. In 2016, Jordy Nelson was still that guy. Davante Adams' first big season, he has 12 TDs working off of that. Garrett Wilson could have 12 TDs working off of that. Now, there are some potential negative outcomes where, Lazard still continues to hit in the red zone and score the TDs, even if he's not getting a lot of targets. All that kind of thing could happen. There's outs for Wilson, man, to still have a really strong season. It's not as great. The floor is a little lower. One of the comps in my head is Jefferson and Jordan Addison with Minnesota. But like, Adams is not the level of Justin Jefferson is the point, right? And Garrett Wilson's probably a little better than Addison, although you were really, really high on Addison, and he's a really good football player too. But the ways that those two guys combine, and then Aaron Jones is the third weapon in the pass game, now that all might shake up with TJ Hawkinson coming back. But that's the way that it's been for the Vikings so far. That's what you would think. And you think it's pretty concentrated on those guys. And again, a lot of Lazard's production has been kind of fluky plays. So I don't think that Lazard's going to be too much of an issue. I'm with you on pretty much all of that. You kind of transitioned to that after we're talking about the Breece and Bijan thing. The other thing I just wanted to throw in is this Vikings team as well with respect to Bijan. You were talking about going on a team-by-team basis. You mentioned last week or a couple weeks ago, and really since the offseason, that Aaron Jones' workload could be pretty valuable. But you mentioned, I think in the recent couple of weeks, that he's going to be a top 10 running back going forward, as long as he's healthy. He gets banged up a little bit prior to their bye. We don't know where he's at. But the way that he's been used, with Ty Chandler playing a decent amount but only getting low-value touches, and Aaron Jones getting all of the high-value stuff, that split, like Bijan is the Aaron Jones in that scenario, was kind of the way that I was thinking about it when you were talking about Bijan and Algier, where this potential for Bijan to play a lot on the passing downs and to get the goal line work and to have the high-value touch roll locked down. Algier's going to be better than Ty Chandler as far as the production on his mostly low-value stuff. but he's not running any routes, 17% routes. He's not going to threaten Bijan in the pass game stuff, and Bijan's still getting, I think, a little bit better of a green zone role was the point of the way that we talked through that. So it's just, I mean, maybe he's not the 101, but when we talked about Aaron Jones recently, the comment you made about him being still a top 10 running back with that workload, I mean, I think applies to Bijan as well in a similar way. But yeah, the Amari trade is the other one we got to talk about.
The thing with Wilson too, and everybody will have seen this because it was the Monday night game, but he was close to a massive game in week 6 where he's open for the touchdown. The ball hits him, in his left arm, but he's being flagrantly held on one of the most obvious pass interferences you will ever see. So he's not able to get the second arm there to make the catch. And then Rodgers sort of threads the needle to him in a way that is both good and bad. He then does take massive shots from both sides. He was going to make the catch on that play. It was a nice job, great clean hits. He gets the air knocked out of him because of how brutal the hits were. I think that in this situation, it either doesn't work because Rodgers and Adams are no longer what they were. And then in that case, Wilson's targets are still actually, very good, or it works. And Garrett Wilson is a strong threat now to lead the receiver group in touchdowns the rest of the way. I think that Breece Hall is now a threat to be that unicorn 28 point per game score at the running back position. Now, to be clear, that's like a 98th percentile outcome. I'm not saying that that's likely, but it sets the stage for some really exciting fantasy developments.
I love that. Amari Cooper, we got to talk about him. One of the comments I've seen, and I actually really like as a take, is that he's probably just not been very happy with the Browns. He's talked a lot about just not really liking Deshaun Watson, like in different ways, which who would want to work with that guy? He gets to go to the Bills now. Do we see him? I mean, the way I saw this is that he's basically somewhere in like the wide receiver 25 range with upside beyond that. And yeah, there's still going to be a little bit of a rotational thing here with the Bills. And I kind of was like, well, he's going to be in that range, and none of the other guys are actually going to be that important. Like, probably the Mac Hollins stuff goes away, which is nice. I mean, there was a play on this Monday night game where Troy Aikman is saying, I mean, Troy Aikman had some good ones in this game. You mentioned the Breece Hall play out on one-on-one. That was the other thing I wanted to reference, where he goes, he said something about the surprising thing on that play was that Breece Hall didn't make that guy miss and get into the end zone. Like, what happened there? And then later in the game, they do a package of like Taylor Rapp, shout out UW, making some great plays. And they're like, yeah, and he made this great tackle in one-on-one. Like, so they like switched it around to where it was a good play by Taylor Rapp, which maybe it was, but maybe kind of baited Hall into towards the sideline and into contact or what have you. But it was kind of funny. His candid response, Aikman's, was that Hall like didn't do enough, like you were describing. But his other comment, right before a key slant, it's like, this is the biggest play of the game right now, was right before a third down slant at 20-20 late in the game. And we see a slant in one-on-one coverage to Mac Hollins. I tweeted it out as kind of a joke where, you get this comment from the announcer right at the snap that this is a huge play. And what's your go-to play? It's Mac Hollins trying to win on an in-breaker route against man coverage. Doesn't work out for the Bills. They kick a field goal. It doesn't end up being the biggest play. His point was they needed 7 there. It doesn't end up mattering because Rodgers throws the pick on the other side and the Bills still win. But Hollins, I think you're like, man, if we have to go to Mac Hollins in that spot, we got to get Amari Cooper in here. You're going to still have Curtis Samuel rotational, but he's not doing a lot. You're going to have Khalil Shakir rotational, but he looks like more of a role player than a true number one. I think people are a little too hyped on his role. I talked about it in Signals a few weeks ago when he had like 6 catches at a negative ADOT. It was all underneath stuff. He has made some plays down the field as well since, but he's not like a star. His numbers are better than what he really is. And we see that in this game. Keon Coleman not doing enough either. He's been targeted on these like boundary plays, but he's, it's all 50-50 balls. He's not creating a lot of separation there. It seems like Amari's the guy, and then all that is just a jumble. The other name that matters to us here, Sean, is Dalton Kincaid, who, we're not getting enough air yards and downfield stuff from him either. It's kind of similar to the Shakir thing, but he's getting more of the underneath stuff with intent early in games. Often, a lot of the short stuff He leads the team in targets here, very low ADOT. Pretty good game, but not anything great. I just want to see him get one of those downfield plays. We talked about last week, the Houston game, he had a shot for a huge play. 7 targets in this one, only 33 air yards, 4.7 ADOT. But still, I mean, a good game from him. He catches 6 of them for 51. As far as tight ends go, it's, not a great game, but it's fine. One of the notes I also had before I kick it to you is people might see the Dawson Knox touchdown and think, oh, Dawson Knox's red zone role negatively impacted Kincaid. Kincaid was also on the field on that play. They were on the field together. There was a 2 tight end situation. It's not like Kincaid came off. Just because they both played tight end doesn't mean, Knox got a scramble drill touchdown. He's going to do that kind of stuff, but it wasn't actually negative for Kincaid, who ran a season high 80% of the routes in this game. I'm still pretty excited about Kincaid maybe working off Amari, but you'd like to see him get downfield a little more. What do you think the Amari addition means for him? Does Amari have, increasing upside? What does it mean for the pass catchers that are there, the wide receivers, and obviously Kincaid being the big one for us? Also, some notes on Judy and Njoku, if you have any thoughts on them. I know you've been interested in Njoku as he comes back to health, and obviously Judy's a guy that you've liked. There's going to be some value. There's going to be some volume there for him now.
I don't know. Again, that's why I was looking up that Will Levis versus Deshaun Watson competition, because we're at the point now where the passes are bad enough that you can't evaluate any of the players. So you have no idea what Amari Cooper is currently. Jerry Jeudy, and I love him, but he would be just as effective with no hands. His effort to make catches is not non-existent. It's somehow negative. Like, watching the Browns
with no hands, a wide receiver. That's one of your best.
I have no idea what they're doing or what is happening. Also, one of the things for Jeudy is they're, leading into the season, all of these positive notes about his ability to get open. You watch them right now and you're like, I don't know if it's the design or if he knows that if he gets open, Deshaun Watson is going to either A, miss him, or B, throw the pass in some completely different area. But he doesn't seem like he's getting open. He's making no effort on any part, at least to the casual observer. The true situation is probably different, but that gives you a sense of kind of where we are and thinking through this Cleveland Browns team. You think about Amari Cooper.
Well, before we go to the Bills, while we're here, does that mean you have some optimism about Njoku, who I know you've been into adding to some of our teams and maybe we haven't talked about a bunch, and Nick Chubb, who you've been, I think, a little bit more optimistic than listeners may assume in terms of, again, what we're doing on our teams. I've been seeing it behind the scenes. Sounds like Chubb's going to be ready to play this week, and Jerome Ford got hurt last week. What are you thinking about, like, his ramp up, and should listeners in shallower leagues be going out and adding Chubb? Like, you just talked about the Browns' huge issues with Watson. Are they going to just be really run heavy with Chubb going forward? Is it possible he gets a lot of work?
Well, one of the super weird things about the Browns has been that last year, Jerome Ford's very surface level production was fine, but a lot of his peripherals were very negative, to where people were enthusiastic about some of the other guys on that roster as a result, knowing that Chubb was going to miss a lot of time. Ford's peripherals and some of his results this year are excellent. And so you did run a little bit of the risk, I think, of what we talked about with Hubbard, until, and that's especially shocking given how dysfunctional the team has been. You would really anticipate that with as bad as Deshaun Watson has played, that any moving of the ball at all, any scoring from the running back position, and this was a game where Pierre Strong actually played pretty well. You wouldn't think that was possible. You'd be expecting a lot more of what we've got from the Denver Broncos from the running back position. So you look at that now, and with that injury, the timeline, at least for me as we're recording, is a little bit unclear, but I do think that opens the door. I do think that Nick Chubb is going to be some version of himself that is viable, if not what he was, because what he was the type of runner that, even almost like throw all the way back to, like I say, a Jim Brown, to think of someone who really did the kinds of things that Nick Chubb at his size could do. We're probably not going to get that. But yeah, the other thing here with Deshaun Watson is they have been very, very stubborn about him being the guy that they have to give every chance to because of the contract, and it's not just the contract. Like, we took a PR hit for the ages in order to try and do this. We have to make sure it's not going to work. But those are all the things that you have to do right up until you change your mind. You get that rhetoric about coaches who are about to be fired, QBs who are about to be benched. Some teams do play it differently. The Pittsburgh Steelers have made no. I mean, they're like, yeah, anybody could play quarterback for us this week. We don't think our guys are good, and we don't think it matters. So you have some teams that approach it like that.
TJ Watt's playing QB this week. That's all we care about.
But I do think that we have a benching in the future, at which point David Njoku, maybe Jerry Jeudy, certainly Nick Chubb. As hard as it is to believe right now, the Cleveland Browns are going to be an important part of the fantasy playoffs, I think. And so you want to continue, as long as it's very inexpensive, you want to create exposure to guys who are going to get touches in that offense.
I love those notes. As you were talking through Chubb and the potential for him to actually be good, obviously we know it's a massive injury. And we know that a lot of people have had a lot of injury pessimism for a lot of different injuries. And we've maybe been too optimistic at times. The ones that have worked out have been guys that had talent to spare, is the point that I want to drive home. Breece Hall last year, people were even saying had a breakaway run early, but there was like a Sunday night game, week 2 or so, had a long run and then it like faded off. And I remember he had to like fade off and run out of bounds or something at like the 5-yard line. And everyone's like, he would have housed that before. And I'm like, well, he still had an 80-yard run. I remember like showing the run in Stealing Signals, the dots, right, from Next Gen Stats. People were trying to say, well, look, he's not himself. Well, yeah, he's not himself, but it's still really good. 80% of him. That's the point you made about Dobbins. Maybe 80% of him is good enough. And that's what we've seen, right? That's another guy this year. Maybe that's the point, right? Nick Chubb's a dude that can squat 1 million pounds and can jump over a mountain and whatever. I mean, maybe his vert isn't that great, but this guy's an incredible athlete. His knee is really jacked up. One of the things we know about how the body works is like the muscles support the joints. We talked about this a little bit in the off season, but like when you get physical therapy, you get a little older. I have shoulder issues. You got to work on the muscles around it to strengthen the joint. Well, Nick Chubb's muscles around his knee are bigger than my head. Like they're massive. Like this guy's maybe the one dude who doesn't need a knee, right? I mean, I'm just saying, like we're too certain about a lot of things that are uncertain in fantasy. And so if you're one of those people who is very confident that Nick Chubb can't do it because the knee injury was so gruesome, Nick Chubb's not the guy that I want to be betting against. Is sort of the point I was going to say. Shawn, we gotta close up soon, but I gotta let you talk about that Bills trade. What are you thinking on that side? What are you thinking about Dalton Kincaid?
Kincaid has been so weird and so frustrating because every week you're like, man, he's close. There were a couple plays in this game where you're like, he's close, and then you have that touchdown to Dawson Knox. Man, if like that was only Kincaid, we'd be all right. I think there's the tendency to view it the way that you want it to be, which is that I do think the rest of the receivers do virtually nothing for them. And so if you are a defender or you're a defensive coach, you're scheming it up, you're trying to take Dalton Kincaid away, I think that Amari Cooper probably helps that without meaningfully hurting him. And so if anything, it's probably a mild boost. I have no idea what Amari Cooper is, right? He was so good so early for the Raiders. Things faded out. You're like, oh, this guy just doesn't have it. It's going to maybe even be one of those situations where, you think about a Sammy Watkins, you think about an Odell Beckham, you think about some of these guys, Kenny Britt, where injuries played a role in those guys disappearing. But Cooper was bad. And then he goes to the Cowboys and you're like, oh my goodness. I mean, it was all the Raiders. And Amari Cooper is one of the best players in the NFL. And you go with that for a while, and eventually CeeDee Lamb emerges, and Amari Cooper is simply bad. to the point where they blame him for a playoff loss. They get rid of him. He goes to the Browns and is like, oh, Amari Cooper's back, right? It just, again, was contextual. Last season, he was bad outside of the massive game with Joe Flacco. So again, you're thinking, well, it's just context because you get a QB who's willing to throw it like Joe Flacco and gives the receiver actually an opportunity to show what he can do. And the numbers are there. I mean, Josh Allen is Joe Flacco, but who can run around, who can do everything, right? He's going to give you a chance. So maybe this just follows that pattern where Amari Cooper is back and is not just good, but he's a star. The range of outcomes on this, though, is so wide that Amari Cooper could be done to the point where he doesn't do much more than Khalil Shakir, Keon Coleman, that he basically integrates into the offense as another role player, which I do think will help them, but that is basically just that level of player. And from a fantasy perspective, it doesn't help him a ton and almost doesn't even hurt those guys a ton because mostly it's going to come out of, even if you just scheme it differently, it's not necessarily the same routes, but it comes out of plays that would have gone to Mac Hollins or would have gone to Curtis Samuel, two guys who they have needed to run out there, but probably aren't doing anything. Keon Coleman, I think, is kind of the weird one here where you're wondering if he will eventually emerge. He's had some air yards at times. This most recent game, he was underneath. He's flashed what he did well in college, which is to run after the catch, even though he's a big guy who doesn't have great straight line speed. But his overall body control and athleticism is excellent. And so with the ball in his hands, he's pretty intriguing. This is probably going to sound weird to some listeners. Blair and I received a dynasty offer last week that was essentially Keon Coleman for Bucky Irving. And I was like, why would you trade someone again before you know what Sean Tucker is going to do? Why would you trade one of your favorite guys who has hit for someone you were very skeptical of who hasn't really hit? But we made that move. Now, part of it was based on roster. We needed a receiver a lot more than running back. And also in Dynasty, receiver holds the value a lot better. Keon Coleman, probably one of those guys that you can trade next year without a huge loss, even if he continues to be underwhelming. But I think that in fairness, you've got to be open-minded to the idea that he might be a second half of the season emergence type of guy. He certainly hasn't looked like a Brian Thomas, but maybe you get a little bit more than that. I don't think he's looked any different, say, than Ladd McConkey. That's one that you and I are in a little bit of a different place on. I don't know. I mean, we're coming off of a week where the Bills look good again on offense, in part because the Jets were dealing with so many injuries that it was definitely not the real Jets defense they were facing. The previous week, he had one of his worst games ever. The Bills could go out there and have 5 more games where they win by 30 and 3 more games where they lose by 15 to a team with a losing record. You have no idea what you're going to get from this version of Buffalo.
Yeah, it's going to be fun. This has been fun. Week 6 was fun. The trades are fun. There is so much happening in fantasy football right now. We talked about it a little bit for the first couple weeks. It didn't seem indicative of the rest of the year. It was very run heavy. Things weren't looking great, all of that kind of stuff out of the gate. We're in a mid-season mode, Sean. Fantasy football has picked up. The things that are going to define this year are starting to come into shape a little bit better. The things that might come into shape down the road are starting to come into shape now. We're starting to form. We talked about it in part 1 with the Kamani Vidals is the guy that I'm thinking of right now. And those examples. This is a fun thing we get to do. This was a really fun week. So much happening right now in the fantasy space. Yeah, I'm excited. I'm excited for week 7. I'm excited to see what happens. It's one of the other things worth noting. This next little bit here. Had a lot of buys in weeks 5 and 6, 4 each week. We only have 4 total in the next 3 games. So we're having this moment now where for fantasy matchups, there's fewer guys on buys for the next few weeks. You're going to be a little bit, you usually enter the buys and you're just relentlessly pummeled with players that are out on all your teams. But we have this weird schedule this year for a couple weeks here. We're not going to have too many guys missing in too many spots. We're going to see a lot of these teams over the next couple weeks. We're going to see how they keep evolving. I'm excited, man. It's going to be a fun next little stretch.
It should be awesome. My fantasy enthusiasm mid-season is at an all-time high. It's always nice when your teams are doing well. Ben, you and I have had great success in the FFPC. We hope that everyone listening is doing well in whatever your format of choice is. A couple of the only teams that I have struggling are with Colin and with Blair. I know it is possible. Anybody who is off to a little bit slower start, we're rooting for you as well. There is still time. I think that if you have put together a deep roster, you're ready to make your move. Good luck to everybody as we go forward here. This has been Stealing Bananas. I'm Shawn Siegele. With me as always is Ben Gretch. You can follow at Yards Per Gretch. Get one of his fun Joe Flacco tweets. You don't want to miss that. Stealing Signals. He mentioned in the first show this week that you can get it read to you by AI if you prefer that. Stealing Lines. Get all the betting information. His project there with Dalton Cates. Don't forget to subscribe, click notifications for the Stealing Signals YouTube. Know when Ben goes live on those. We'd love to have you over RotoViz. Coupon code RVRadio2024. Check out for 10% off your 1-year subscription. Join Colin Kelly and myself on RotoViz Overtime. We love you guys. We'll talk to you soon.